All right, good evening. So we're in lesson 2 tonight, the wilderness of the human experience. Did you do your homework? So the first thing that I wanted you to do, and we'll come to that in just a moment, is to look for stories, look for news headlines or internet articles or anything like that that would display the state of affairs on this life. And we'll come to that in just a moment. I've already gotten some good questions from you. Are we going to talk about this? Or what do you think about this kind of situation? Or do I understand this verse correctly? Questions like that. And that was just after the first lesson that we had last week. So my answer to some of you has been, yes, we're going to get there. Hang on. We're going to talk about that. So hopefully, while in this class of 13 lessons, I'm sure we will not answer all the questions that we may come up with. We're going to do our best to answer some of them. But we don't have to try very hard to find stories of hardship and suffering and pain. It's actually quite easy to do that. We really don't have to turn over many stones to find them. You turn on the television for just 10 minutes, and you can see some things that are very troubling. You read the newspaper, and you see the behavior and the actions of people that are just bizarre or just plain evil. And you wonder, how do people get to this point where they can commit these kinds of atrocities? So I'm curious to know, what did you come up with? Share with me some of the things that you found that were news stories, internet articles, whatever it was, that illustrate how much suffering and pain and hardship there is in the world. Willeen, you're the first one I saw.
One thing I love that really bothered me is when they showed about 8 children that had been dropped off from Honduras or somewhere. No parents, no money.
Okay.
And that's
Just left to fend for themselves, right? And how terrible that is. And when you think about a story like that, just children who, and I'm assuming it was an immigration kind of a matter, I assume, some children, migrant children from Honduras, I think you said, who were just left to fend for themselves. Specifically, though, what bothered you about that? And it could be a lot of things.
they're going to be by themselves. They have no
Okay, so where are the parents, right? Where's parental responsibility? What kinds of dangerous things are they going to run into, right? I mean, there's any number of things about a situation like that that's very troubling. All right, somebody else, give me another one. Yeah, how many of you had that on your list? The Brooklyn subway shooter. Yeah, 29 people whose lives have been directly affected. Some of them, how many? Is it 10 who've been killed? 10 dead? Is that the latest? Oh, none have died? Oh, I thought I heard somewhere that 10 had died and there were 29 total shot or something. Okay, interesting. All right, well, obviously we're watching different news sources or something. I don't know. Okay, but why would somebody do that, right? And we see these kinds of things and we wonder about it. Why do they do this? What's going on? You know, is there? We wonder about the mental condition of a person, but what does that point to ultimately? The fact that we're in a world where mental diseases and things like that are even a thing, right? I mean, all that does is underscore what we're talking about. Carol?
Well, and then in Maryland and in California, they're going to put on the ballot this year that they call it abort, but that you can murder a baby up to 28 days after birth. And that's going on the ballot for people to vote on. Can you believe we live in a country?
That's unreal. It's unreal. We may come back to that in just a little while. Celeste. Wow. Is that a lot? Wow. And where was that? You said it was a multi-state thing? Okay. Okay. See, the only one of these stories that I've even heard about was the subway thing. I hadn't even heard about the other ones. And all that does is illustrate that there's so much bad stuff out there. Todd?
Just thinking locally, hearing about the 24-year-old kid who died off the bridge downtown.
Yes. The school shooting a couple of weeks ago here. I mean, that's one of those things that, oh, that'll never happen where I live, right? And it did. Anything else?
What about Disney supported transgenderism?
Okay. All right. Good. All the wokeism stuff that's going on and how troubling that is. How far we have gotten away from he made them male and female and the simplicity of that. Nobody said Russia and Ukraine yet. That I'm sure that was on our minds. The horrific stories coming out of the Ukraine, hospitals and maternity wards being bombed and schools being bombed, children's innocents being killed just ruthlessly for no reason at all. David?
One that caught my eye that's related to that, as an educator, a school board in Virginia has said to students who were distraught about what's happening in Ukraine, and they were wearing some T-shirts saying "Pray for peace." The Board of Education has said you cannot wear that. That's prohibited. Students wearing a shirt that says "Pray."
Of course. All right. That doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise any of us anymore, does it? All right. This is no boast. Okay. So please don't take it that way. I don't intend for it to be that. But last month, I gave a donation to a nonprofit group that was promoting some efforts in the Ukraine. And 4 or 5 days later, I get a thing in the mail from this ministry, of course, asking for more and that. But it comes with some information inside, and there were pictures of impoverished children in third world countries, and you've seen the commercials, you've seen those kind of pamphlets and things like that before, right? We do realize that that's a real thing, right? There are thousands and thousands of children who have no idea where their next meal is going to come from. All of these things make us keenly aware that life on earth at times is really awful. It's really awful. And I think in some measure we feel sheltered from some of this, maybe because of our citizenship in this great country. We feel maybe sheltered. Well, that could never happen to us. Well, we've probably said some things like that before, and yet it's happening. Whatever it is that we said would never happen, it is happening. But they're talking about food shortages later this year to hit this country. That's not something we should dismiss. Now, I think there's a cool-headed way to approach these kinds of things. I'm not trying to be alarmists, but realists about the things that are going on. So even in this country, we can experience things like this, but more personally and more directly, the kinds of things that we experience oftentimes have to deal with personal sickness and chronic pain. Sometimes people have experienced the loss of a child. Maybe it was a miscarriage. Maybe it was a stillborn. Maybe it was a child who had grown on into adulthood but died from a car accident or something like that. All of this is life in the wilderness. And at times it seems there is nothing good, there's nothing beautiful, there's nothing positive, and there is nothing wherein we can find hope. It feels that way at times. Now, I've added another exercise here that's not in your material. I asked you to look for news headlines and news stories about things. I want you to do the same thing, but now instead, I want you to think about biblical examples of suffering and evil and pain. And I want us to think about some of those together. And because I didn't ask you to do it beforehand, I want to give you 2 minutes to think about that. All right, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Don't mind the awkward silence, okay? I'll just be staring into your souls from up here. All right, 2 minutes. I want you to think about some biblical examples. Jot them down, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. Okay, about 20 more seconds. Okay, I didn't think it was fair to just spring that on you without any preparation. Just, give me answers now. So I wanted you to be able to have a couple of moments to think about that and see what you could come up with. So can you think of biblical examples of pure evil being perpetrated on others? Dad? Okay, good. I want to come back to that one. I had that in my notes as well. Charles? Man, you guys, both of you took my, all right, I'm going to come back to that. Good job. Good thought. Okay, Ben and then Charles. Yes, I'm glad somebody said that. Good. Charles. Okay. Stephen's not doing anything to hurt anybody, right? He's just doing what his conscience and conviction tells him he ought to do, and look at how he was treated. What else?
I'm not sure I heard what they said up there, but I'm thinking of Saul and others who punished the early believers in Christ.
Okay, good. Yeah. Right. Charles made a comment about Stephen being killed, but you're just broadening the point. John the Baptist being killed simply for, yeah, that's right. He just got on the wrong side of someone. Okay, Dad? Okay, yeah. Absalom, though, I mean, he kind of deserved it, though, right? Although David did give explicit orders, don't hurt him, and Joab did it anyways. Yeah. Okay, good. Joe. Okay. All right, good. Right. Yes, good. We're going to spend lots of time on Job this quarter and making references to him. You know, it's almost like it was by design that this Bible class followed our Bible reading of Job. Wow, how coincidental. Chris?
Joseph.
Good. Joseph suffered a lot and did so innocently. Diana? Okay, the rich man and Lazarus, and here's this poor man Lazarus who just has this miserable existence, and the contrast with the rich man who just has the best of everything. Okay, good. So, okay, two more, Sandy and then Trudy. Oh, yeah, you remember my sermon a month ago, yeah. I know. Amnon and Tamar, that story was what Sandy said. Trudy, go ahead. Yes, right. Judges 17 through 21 is like one of the most depressing spots of the Bible. There's a lot of really bad stuff that happens there. Yes, sir.
I couldn't pass this up. So, is the commandments given by hearing and reading immediately following the death of Jesus, and the death of all those innocent children?
Yeah, right after the birth of Jesus. Okay, good. That's a segue because I wanted to go there. Matthew's gospel has as bookends almost two events of senseless evil where innocent people suffer. Bill and my dad just said it. It also goes back to the comment that Carol made earlier about abortion laws that are passing, or at least potentially passing in a couple of states. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16, you have the declaration from Herod to kill the male children born in and around Bethlehem. Now, I don't think that was something that we should understand to be a wide-scale thing. It says it was around Bethlehem. So I don't get the impression that there were like thousands and thousands of boys killed. Bethlehem was a pretty small town. But however many it was, innocent children were killed. And then at the end of Matthew's gospel, of course, God himself, the innocent one, is senselessly, ruthlessly killed. But, bless you, the latter event at the cross, we clearly see from Scripture what God was able to do with that, how he brought about redemption, how he orchestrated that to turn out to be something that blessed the world. And if God can redeem that and make that work in such a way as to bless the world, does that give us some solace and comfort when it comes to the former event from Matthew chapter 2 and the suffering of those babies and those parents? So the overall premise of this class is that God can redeem suffering. God can take something that's bad and evil and hard, and he can take that, if he chooses, and he can turn it into something that is a blessing. So that's ultimately where we're going to go. But so often when people are suffering, they say what Martha said in John chapter 11. So I want you to turn there with me and let's look at this. John chapter 11. The difference, though, is that many people are saying this question or this statement, rather, from a standpoint of skepticism and doubt, whereas Martha, I don't think, was doing that at all. In John chapter 11, Jesus is out of town. He is not in Bethany, which is the city where Mary and Martha and Lazarus live. And he receives word that Lazarus is sick. And the text says in verse 6 that when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Jesus has no urgency about this. He hears that his dear friend Lazarus is sick. Obviously, Jesus is able to do something about it, but he doesn't hastily run to Bethany to lay his hands on Lazarus or say something to Lazarus and heal him. Now, this is unrelated, but did Jesus need to even go there at all to be able to heal him? No, of course not. He could have just snapped his finger from wherever he was, and he could have done it. But Jesus stays where he is for 2 more days. And then, verse 7, he says, let's go to Judea. And so as Jesus is approaching Bethany and coming to the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, Martha comes out to greet him. And it says in verse 20 that Martha, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Well, we've already said Jesus didn't have to be there. But Martha says, Lord, if you had been here, this bad thing would not have happened. Now, I think this is a statement of faith on Martha's part. She has trust and faith in Jesus that she knows that if he had been there, Lazarus could have been saved. And I say that because of verse 22, where she says, even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. But a lot of people today, in times of suffering and hardship, will say, God, where are you? If you were here, meaning if you were there and you truly were overseeing everything and you were pulling the strings in the world, and if you really cared about me and if you really loved me, then you could have stopped this. My brother would not have died. My daughter would not have died in the accident. My son would not have gotten the cancer diagnosis. My whatever it is, fill in the blank. God, if you had been here, if you had been involved, this would not have happened. Now, first of all, simple question. Is that true? Is it true that if God had chosen to be involved, that particular bad thing would not have happened? Is that true? Not necessarily, okay? Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. And we're going to get to that later on. Maybe it's true, but maybe it's not. But this is one of the atheists' classic arguments. Look at all the suffering in the world. Look at all the pain that's in the world. If there was a God out there, he would stop all of this. He wouldn't let these kinds of terrible things happen. If God is all loving, as you Christians say, then he ought to stop this. Because a loving God, a compassionate God, would never let people go through something like this. So since he doesn't stop it, he must not be loving. He must not care. And if he doesn't care, then that's not the kind of God that I want. Or maybe God does want to stop it, but he can't. He's impotent. His hands are tied. He'd love to put a stop to it, but he's not able to do it. If that's the case, then God is not all powerful, in which case he's not the God that we want to serve. Have you ever heard something like that before? You ever heard that kind of argumentation? There's a guy named Sam Harris who's probably at this very moment writing another book filled with drivel, who has sold millions of books and made multiplied millions of dollars making that basic argument in all of his books. He just cites thousands of examples of pain and suffering, and then he says, well, see, God's not out there. Look, if he was, all this bad stuff wouldn't be happening. Gail?
I think it's interesting, verse 4, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God.
Yes.
that the Son of God may be glorified through it.
Okay, I'm really glad you brought that up. Some of you, I'm sure, were already thinking about that. In verse 4 of John 11, when Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick, he says, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Let's apply this to the big picture of our class. Does Jesus know what's going to happen in the end? Does he know how he's going to order things to make it work out to God's glory? Yes. All right, if Jesus could do that with Lazarus, maybe he can do that with us. Okay? All right. Somebody else had a hand up. Yes, sir.
Do we have a right to set conditions for God?
No.
But isn't that what you're talking about?
No. How do you mean?
God, if you were really God, then you would do this. Who says?
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yes. Right.
Who says? What right do I have
Yes.
to be able to say what God should or should not do?
All right. Good.
I don't have to.
We're going to spend a lot of time on that idea in a future lesson. That's a good thought. Diana?
The Bible tells us that God causes all things, whether it's good or bad.
Yeah, we're going to get there.
Okay.
All right. Martha was no atheist. Okay? Martha doesn't say, Lord, why weren't you here? You should have been here. And because my brother died, that must mean that you're not here. No, that's clearly not what it is. Martha was a firm believer. And so it isn't just God's enemies who struggle with this. All the bad stuff happening in the world. If God really was there, then Christians struggle with this too. And it's okay to do that. It's okay for us to not have answers. Can you believe the preacher just said it's okay to not have answers? Yes, it is. And again, we have a whole nother lesson on that coming up. But let's understand this. As Christians, we believe that God, in some form or fashion, has his hands in everything that happens on the earth. Here's what I mean. Let me give you some examples, biblical examples, okay? Daniel chapter 4, 3 times in that chapter, the text says that the Most High rules over the realm of mankind, and he gives it power, kingship to whomever he wishes. God raises up nations and kings, and he humbles nations and kings and brings them down. I see no reason that that does not still apply to us today. God is intricately involved in the rising and the falling of nations. I think the Bible teaches that. Now, I don't have all the particulars of that worked out. I leave that to him, but he's involved in that. That's kind of a macro example. But how about this? In Matthew chapter 10, in verses 29, Jesus said he knows all the little sparrows in the sky. And in verse 30, he said he knows how many hairs are on your head. If he knows all of that, is there anything that escapes his notice? Is God sitting on his throne and he suddenly hears about what's happening in Ukraine and he goes, oh, wow, I didn't know about that. Oh, wow, this is terrible. What is that Putin guy doing? I can't believe these terrible things that are going on. No, he is keenly aware of all of these things. God is not surprised by all this stuff. Now, again, I don't want to necessarily speak for God. I certainly don't want to speak for God. I'm not sure how far to carry this. I think this is one of the things that we wrestle with as we try to think about these biblical truths. God raises up nations and kings, and he makes others fall. Well, how does he do that? What are the mechanics of that? I don't know. It's not for me to know. It's for God to know and for God to do as he sees fit. But let's not think for a moment that God doesn't know about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, or that he doesn't care, or that he's not interested. No, he knows everything there is to know about it. And yet, what is he doing with that? Well, we'll get there. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, man. Honestly, I don't even know how much of this we can actually grasp at the level at which God works. In fact, just the commentary, and thinking about it, is probably so, we just can't even get there.
I agree. And if you have a book, another lesson or two from now, I even make a statement about that where I say, everything I'm asking you to read in this lesson, I don't understand. But the Bible says it, and we need to believe it. So I want to share with you a quote from Jim McGuigan's book. I thought this was helpful. It's a little long, so I'll go slow with it. However complex all of this is, maybe there's a way to see God in and through the curse that the world staggers under. Maybe there's a way to see him in and through it rather than just after it. Let me pause and tell you what he's saying there. Can we see God in the midst of suffering and pain, not just after the fact, where we can look back and say, providentially, I think God was doing such and such. That's wonderful that we think we can do that and we can look back through the eyes of faith and see God's providence. That's great. But what we're after in this class is to say, but we don't have to wait until the other side in order to feel that God is with us in it. We need to be confident that God is with us in and through our suffering, not just after. Now let me continue. Maybe we don't have to wring our hands in unrelieved bewilderment. It might be that God offers us the option to see suffering in all its forms as his redemptive work. Now notice this last expression he uses. And what we need is more courage to drink our share of the cup. Ooh. I love the way he said that. We need more courage to drink our share of the cup. To say to God, suffering and pain and hardship is a part of the human experience. But if it leads us to glory, then give me a big old cup of it. I'm willing to take that on because I see you in it and you can help me with it. All right. We're not even getting to the second page of your material, but I do just want to mention this. You notice there were no questions or anything on that section. I really just wanted you to read that and kind of think through some of these well-known stories. Was any of this surprising to you that these things happened in the wilderness? The story of Joseph being thrown into the pit completely missed that it happened in the wilderness. Genesis 37, verse 22 says. I completely missed that. I don't know how many times I've read that story. Joseph is in a wilderness, literally and figuratively. But we know how it ends with Joseph. When Hagar and Ishmael are both facing their difficulties of being cast out away from Abraham and Sarah's presence, where do they go? Where does God provide for them? In the wilderness. Moses, did you catch this? When God spoke to him at the burning bush in Exodus 3, where was he? He was in the wilderness, but specifically, where was he? He was at Mount Sinai. And God effectively says, one of these days I'm going to bring you back here with a massive horde of people behind you. Elijah fled from Jezebel's wrath by going into the wilderness. And God took care of him there. John the Baptist is the one who is crying in the wilderness, bringing words of salvation for God's people. And Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Who led Jesus into the wilderness? God did. The Spirit did. Led him into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days. Interesting. How long was Israel in the wilderness? 40 years. Israel flunked every test in the wilderness. Jesus passed all of his with flying colors. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Good. Yeah. Hosea 2 and verse 14. and I think we actually have that in a future lesson as well. But that beautiful idea that God says, I'm going to go and rescue her, and I'm going to take her into the wilderness and there enter into that relationship with her again. All right. Some of the lessons have, as the bottom of page 9 does, a little gray box that says point to ponder. This is just a short little thought that I want you to tuck away and think about. The wilderness is not the end. It may just be the beginning. Your suffering is not the end. Yeah, but what if my suffering takes my life? It's not the end. It's just the beginning. All right. Thank you, everyone.